He should have called 911, but instead, he reached for a second plate. The steak was just starting to sizzle, the cheap cast iron pan popping softly as fat rendered into a thin, smoky sheen, when the roof above Ethan Cole's kitchen gave a low, unnatural groan, not like old wood settling, but like something pressing down from the sky with impossible weight. And then the sound came, sharp, metallic, final, followed by a burst of splinters and dust as something tore straight through the ceiling and slammed onto his dinner table, scattering utensils, cracking ceramic, and sending a shockwave through the small cabin that rattled every loose screw in the walls. And for a moment Ethan just stood there, spatula in hand, watching the smoke drift through the new hole where his roof used to be as cold night air poured in, carrying with it the faint scent of ozone and something else, something not from around here. The thing that had crashed into his home didn't move at first, half buried in the remains of his table, its form outlined by dim, flickering light from a device on its arm that hummed unevenly like it was struggling to stay alive. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath you take when your brain hasn't caught up to reality yet, before stepping forward, boots crunching lightly over broken wood and glass. And that's when he saw her, skin the color of deep ocean under moonlight, faintly luminescent, hair like strands of silver catching the dim kitchen light, her body wrapped in a suit that looked less like fabric and more like something engineered, sleek and precise, but torn in places where the impact had been too much even for it. And then her eyes opened. They locked onto him instantly, sharp, aware, calculating, and faster than his instincts could even decide what to do. Her arm snapped up and something like a blade, thin, glowing faintly at the edges, extended toward his throat, stopping just inches away, steady despite the way her breathing hitched, shallow and uneven, and the air between them felt tight, like the room itself was holding its breath. "Don't move," she said, her voice low, controlled, carrying an edge that didn't need volume to be taken seriously, and Ethan didn't move, not because he was frozen, but because something about the way she held that blade, perfect, precise, trained, told him this wasn't someone guessing. This was someone who didn't miss. For a long second, neither of them spoke, the only sound the quiet hiss of the pan behind him and the faint, irregular hum of whatever was keeping her suit functional, and Ethan's eyes flicked once to the blade, then back to her face, taking in the tension there, the subtle tremor she couldn't quite hide, the way her posture was locked in discipline even as her body betrayed the strain of whatever she'd just gone through. And then, slowly, deliberately, he turned away from her. The blade didn't move closer, but he could feel it there, like a line drawn in the air behind him as he stepped back to the stove, flipped the steak with a soft press of the spatula, and reached for a second plate from the cabinet like none of this was out of the ordinary, like there wasn't a stranger from the sky standing in his kitchen deciding whether he lived or died. "You're bleeding," he said, not looking at her, his tone calm, almost casual, like he was pointing out a leaky pipe or a loose hinge. And there was a pause behind him, just a fraction too long, like the words hadn't landed where they were supposed to. And when she spoke again, there was something different in it, not weaker, but uncertain. "That is not your concern, human." Ethan shrugged slightly, sliding the steak onto the plate, the aroma filling the room, warm and grounded and stubbornly normal against the cold air pouring in from above. "It is when it's on my floor," he replied, setting the plate down on the counter before reaching for another, his movements steady, unhurried, as if time hadn't just fractured open around them. And for the first time since she'd woken, the blade wavered. Not much, not enough to be called hesitation, but enough to be noticed, and Ethan, still not turning around, added quietly, "You can keep pointing that thing at me, or you can sit down and eat before you pass out." Silence followed, heavier this time, stretching just long enough to matter. And somewhere in that silence, something shifted, small and almost invisible, but real, like the first crack in ice that's been frozen too long, and the pan gave one last soft hiss as the heat died down, leaving only the quiet hum of a broken machine. The cold night air, and the impossible moment where a man chose dinner over fear. The blade did not lower, but it no longer advanced, hovering in that narrow space between threat and restraint as the scent of cooked meat filled the cabin, warm and grounding, cutting through the sharp tang of ozone and splintered wood, and Ethan could feel her watching him, Not the way a predator tracks prey, but the way someone studies something unfamiliar, something that does not fit into any known pattern. And he kept his movements simple, deliberate, setting the second plate beside the first, the ceramic clicking softly against the counter, a small, ordinary sound that seemed almost out of place after everything that had just happened. "Sit," he said, not turning, not commanding, just offering, like the word itself carried no weight beyond the moment. And behind him there was a shift, subtle, the faint scrape of something against the floor as she adjusted her stance, her breathing still uneven but less sharp now. And when she spoke, her voice carried a note that had not been there before, something quieter, edged with confusion rather than certainty. "You assume I require sustenance." Ethan gave a small shrug, finally glancing over his shoulder, meeting her eyes for a fraction of a second before looking back at the plates. "You crashed through my roof at about 200 miles per hour, he said evenly. "I am guessing you require something." The silence that followed stretched, but it was different now, less like a standoff and more like a question waiting to be answered, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the glow along the edge of her blade dimmed, not disappearing, but softening, as if whatever system powered it was no longer being pushed to its limit, and she took one step forward, then another, each movement controlled, measured, like she was testing the ground beneath her feet, and Ethan noticed the way her posture dipped just slightly with each step, the strain she was trying to hide, the precision that was beginning to fray at the edges. She stopped a few feet from the counter, close enough now that he could see the fine details of her skin, the faint patterns that caught the light, the way her eyes shifted as they tracked every motion he made. And for a long moment, she simply stood there, the blade still in her hand, angled down now instead of at his throat, as if she had not yet decided whether to let it go or hold on to it a little longer. Ethan picked up the plate and slid it across the counter toward her, the motion slow, unthreatening, the kind of gesture that belonged in a different world entirely, one where strangers did not arrive through ceilings with weapons drawn, and the plate stopped just within her reach, the heat from the food rising in faint waves. "It is not poisoned," he added, almost as an afterthought. "If I wanted you gone, I would not have fixed you a meal first." Her eyes flicked from the plate to his face, searching, calculating, and then back again, and for the first time since she had appeared, there was a hesitation that did not come from weakness but from something else entirely, something like uncertainty layered over years of certainty, and slowly, with a movement that seemed far more significant than it should have been, she lowered herself onto the edge of a broken chair, the wood creaking under the shift of weight, the blade in her hand, retracting with a soft, almost reluctant hum. She did not reach for the food immediately, instead studying it as if it were some kind of device she had never encountered, her head tilting slightly, the faint glow from her damaged arm unit reflecting off the surface of the plate, and Ethan leaned back against the counter, giving her space, letting the moment stretch without forcing it forward. "What is it?" she asked finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge. "Dinner," he said simply. She looked at him again, and this time the question in her eyes was not about survival or threat or escape, but something deeper, something she did not yet have the words for, and when she reached out, her fingers paused just above the plate, hovering there for a second like she was crossing an invisible line, before finally making contact, and the moment she did, something shifted in the room again, subtle but undeniable, like a system recalibrating around a new variable it had never accounted for. And for the first time since she had opened her eyes, she did not look like a weapon waiting to be used, but like someone encountering something entirely new. She did not eat like someone who was hungry, at least not in any way Ethan recognized. There was no rush, no urgency, only a careful, almost analytical motion as she lifted a small portion of the food and held it just in front of her, watching it, as if expecting it to react first. And for a moment Ethan wondered if she even trusted the idea of something given without a cost. Then slowly, deliberately, she brought it closer, paused again, and finally took a bite, and the reaction was immediate. But not dramatic. Her expression did not change in any obvious way, but her eyes shifted, just slightly, the sharp focus softening into something else, something less guarded, and she remained very still as she processed it, as if her entire system had paused to evaluate this single, unfamiliar input. The hum from her arm device flickered unevenly, casting faint pulses of light across the damaged kitchen, and Ethan noticed the way her shoulders lowered a fraction, tension releasing in increments too small to measure unless you were looking for them. And he found himself watching not out of fear anymore, but out of quiet curiosity, like observing a machine learning a new function in real time. "It is warm," she said after a moment, her voice quieter than before, the words chosen carefully, like she was translating a concept that did not fully exist in her language. Ethan let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, and leaned his weight against the counter, arms relaxed at his sides. "That is usually the idea," he replied, his tone steady, simple, offering no pressure, and she glanced at him again, longer this time, studying him not as a target, not even as a variable, but as something unresolved, something that did not fit into any category she had been trained to recognize. She took another bite, faster this time, less hesitation, and then another, the movements still controlled but no longer delayed, and the faint color along her skin seemed to shift subtly with each passing second, not brighter, but steadier, as if whatever internal system had been struggling was beginning to stabilize, and Ethan noticed the way her breathing evened out, the sharp edges smoothing into something more regular, more sustainable. "Your behavior is inefficient," she said suddenly, not looking at him, her focus still on the plate in front of her. "You allowed a potential threat to remain within reach. You provided resources without securing advantage. She stopped, the sentence trailing off as if the logic had nowhere left to go, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering her words before answering. "Yeah," he said simply. "I do that sometimes." That earned him another look, sharper now, but not hostile, more like confusion layered over something else she could not quite define, and she set the utensil down slowly, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the plate as if grounding herself in the physical reality of it. "In my world," she continued, her voice steady again but softer at the edges, "kindness is a liability. It creates openings. Weakness. It is corrected." Ethan nodded once, not disagreeing, not arguing, just acknowledging, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching between them, filled only by the faint wind slipping through the broken ceiling and the low, persistent hum of her damaged equipment. Then he pushed himself off the counter, walked past her without hesitation, and reached for a small cloth from a drawer, running it under the sink before handing it to her. The gesture as casual as everything else he had done, as if this was still just another evening, another small task to take care of. "Well," he said, glancing briefly at the faint streak of dark fluid along her arm, then back to her face. "Good thing you are not in your world right now." She looked down at the cloth in her hand, then back at him, and something shifted again, deeper this time, not in her posture or her voice, but in the space behind her eyes, like a system encountering a variable it had never been designed to process. And for the first time, the question forming there was not about him, but about herself. The cloth stayed in her hand longer than it should have, her fingers tightening around the damp fabric as if she did not quite understand what to do with something that had been given without instruction, without expectation, and she looked at it, then at him, then back again, her thoughts moving behind her eyes in quiet, rapid calculations that seemed to reach no conclusion, and Ethan did not rush her, he simply moved past, stepping over the broken remains of his table with practiced ease, grabbing a small toolbox from beneath the counter and setting it down with a soft metallic click, as if repairing a roof and hosting an unexpected guest belonged in the same category of normal. The night air slipped through the open gap above, cold and steady, brushing against the back of his neck, and he glanced up once at the jagged hole, measuring it instinctively, estimating wood, nails, time, before shifting his attention back to the present moment, because the roof could wait, but the person sitting in his kitchen could not. "You might want to clean that," he said, nodding slightly toward her arm, his tone the same as before, neutral, practical, and she followed his gaze, looking down at the faint streak along her skin, then at the cloth again, and slowly, cautiously, she pressed it against the surface, her movements precise, controlled, as if even this simple act required deliberate execution. The contact seemed to startle her, not from pain, but from sensation, and her shoulders tensed briefly before easing again, and she watched the mark fade beneath the damp fabric with an intensity that suggested this, too, was new, not the act itself, but the context, the lack of urgency, the absence of command. Injury is typically addressed through automated systems, she said after a moment, her voice steady but quieter than before, as if the volume itself had softened along with something else. Manual care is inefficient. Ethan let out a small breath, setting the toolbox aside for now, leaning one hip against the counter as he crossed his arms loosely, not defensive, just present. Yeah, he replied. Sometimes inefficient things matter anyway. She paused at that, the cloth still pressed lightly against her arm, and her gaze lifted to him again, holding longer this time, searching, not for weakness, but for explanation, and finding none that matched her training. The hum from her arm device flickered again, softer now, less erratic, and she shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting her balance, her movements no longer as rigid as they had been when she first stood, and Ethan noticed that too, the gradual change, the subtle recalibration happening piece by piece. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, a low, steady sound that filled the spaces between their words, and inside, the kitchen felt smaller than before. Not confined, but focused, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only what mattered in that moment. "What is your designation?" she asked suddenly, the question formal, but lacking the earlier edge, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering it before answering. "Ethan," he said. "Just Ethan." She repeated it under her breath, the name unfamiliar on her tongue, as if testing the structure of it, the simplicity, and something in her expression shifted again, a faint narrowing of her eyes, not in suspicion, but in thought. "I am Lyra Vex," she said after a pause, the words carrying a weight that suggested more than just a name, something tied to identity, to function, to purpose, and Ethan nodded once, acknowledging it without comment, without reaction, as if she had just told him what time it was. "All right," he said. "Lyra." The way he said it, without hesitation, without emphasis, seemed to catch her off guard more than anything else had so far, and for a brief second, the composure she had been holding slipped, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the smallest crack beneath it, and she looked down again, at the cloth, at her hand, at the plate in front of her, as if trying to reconcile all of it into something that made sense. "You are not behaving as expected," she said finally, almost to herself. Ethan gave a small shrug, pushing off the counter as he reached for a glass, filling it with water and setting it beside her plate without comment, the gesture quiet, unremarkable, and yet it lingered in the air between them like something far larger. "Yeah," he said, "I get that a lot." And for the first time since she had arrived, Lyra did not respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the glass, on the condensation forming along its surface, on the simple, unguarded act of it being there for her. And in that silence, something continued to shift, slow and steady, like a system learning to operate under entirely new rules. The glass remained untouched for several seconds, small beads of condensation sliding slowly down its surface, catching the dim kitchen light, as if time itself had slowed inside the cabin. And Lyra watched it with the same intensity she had given everything else, not because it was complex, but because it was not, because nothing about this place followed the rules she had been built to understand, and that made even the simplest things feel uncertain. Ethan moved quietly in the background, gathering pieces of broken wood into a rough pile near the wall, his boots scraping lightly against the floor, the rhythm steady and unhurried, and the normalcy of it pressed against the edges of the moment like something stubborn that refused to break, no matter what had just fallen through his roof. "Your dwelling is compromised," Lyra said finally, her voice returning to that precise, measured tone, though softer now, less absolute, and Ethan glanced up briefly before returning to his task, brushing dust from his hands. "Yeah," he said, "that tends to happen when people drop in unannounced." The corner of her expression shifted, not quite a reaction, but something close to it, something that suggested she was beginning to understand more than just the words themselves. She reached for the glass at last, lifting it carefully, her fingers adjusting to its weight, its temperature, and she studied the liquid inside as if expecting it to behave unpredictably, then took a small sip, pausing again as she processed, and this time the shift was more visible, her shoulders easing another fraction, the tension that had defined her posture slowly unwinding in layers. "Hydration," she said quietly, almost confirming it to herself, and Ethan gave a small nod, setting another piece of broken wood aside. "That is also usually the idea." The faint hum from her arm device steadied further, the erratic flicker smoothing into a consistent tone, and she looked down at it briefly, then back at him, something calculating behind her eyes again, but no longer cold, no longer detached. "You are alone here," she observed, her gaze moving across the small cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the tools, the absence of any other presence, and Ethan followed her glance for a moment before shrugging lightly. "Most days," he replied. "It is quieter that way." She considered that, her head tilting slightly, the concept of choosing isolation clearly not aligning with her understanding of survival or function, and for a moment she said nothing, her attention drifting back to the plate, now mostly empty, the act of eating already complete, but the meaning of it still unfolding somewhere beneath the surface. Outside, the wind shifted direction, pushing colder air through the broken ceiling, and Ethan moved toward the small thermostat near the wall, adjusting it with a soft click before grabbing a folded blanket from a nearby chair and placing it within her reach without comment. The gesture as natural as everything else he had done. Lyra looked at the fabric, then at him, and there it was again, that pause, that brief interruption in her internal logic, as if each of these moments was forcing her to rewrite something she had never questioned before. "You continue to allocate resources without strategic return," she said, but the statement lacked conviction now, sounding less like criticism and more like an observation she was no longer certain about. Ethan leaned back against the wall, arms resting loosely at his sides, his gaze steady but not pressing. "Maybe not everything needs a return," he said. The words settled into the space between them, quiet but firm, and Lyra held his gaze this time, not looking away, not dismissing it. And something deeper shifted again, not in her posture or her voice, but in the way she seemed to be seeing him, no longer as a variable to assess, but as something else entirely, something she had no framework for. Her hand moved slowly, almost unconsciously, pulling the blanket slightly closer, not fully wrapping herself in it, but not pushing it away either, and that small, simple action carried more weight than anything she had said so far, a silent acceptance of something she did not yet understand. The cabin remained quiet, the night stretching on outside and inside. The distance between them had changed in a way neither of them had fully realized yet, not measured in steps or space, but in something far less tangible, something that could not be calculated or predicted, only felt as it began to take shape. The quiet did not last, not because something loud happened, but because something subtle changed in the air, a faint vibration that did not belong to the wind or the cabin settling, something distant but precise, like a signal brushing against the edges of perception, and Lyra felt it before she understood it, her entire posture shifting in an instant, shoulders tightening, head turning slightly toward the open ceiling as her eyes sharpened, that earlier softness vanishing beneath trained awareness, and Ethan saw it immediately, the difference, the way she went from uncertain to exact. In less than a breath. "You hear that," he said, not as a question, his voice low, steady, and she did not answer right away, her gaze fixed upward, tracking something invisible, something far beyond the broken roof and the dark sky above. "They found the descent vector," she said finally, her tone returning to that precise cadence. But this time there was something underneath it, not fear, but recognition, inevitability. Ethan straightened slightly, following her line of sight, even though he saw nothing but stars and cold air. "Who is they?" he asked, and Lyra lowered her gaze to him, holding it for a moment as if deciding how much to say. And for the first time since she had given her name, there was hesitation not from confusion, but from choice. "The ones who do not allow failure," she said, the words measured, controlled, but lacking the certainty they might have held before, and the hum from her arm device shifted again, not unstable this time, but alert, responsive, like it had recognized the same signal. Outside, the wind carried on, indifferent, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere tightened, not with panic, but with awareness, and Ethan took a slow breath, then another, grounding himself the same way he always did when something unexpected showed up on his doorstep. "Are they coming here?" he asked, and Lyra's eyes flicked once toward the door, then back to him. "They are already close," she replied. The words settled into the space between them, heavier than anything that had been said so far, and for a brief moment, the old logic tried to reassert itself in her posture. The distance, the separation, the instinct to move, to leave, to eliminate risk, and she shifted slightly in her seat as if preparing to stand, the blanket sliding a fraction from her shoulders, the connection between them thinning just enough to be felt. "I will depart," she said, the statement direct, final, as if returning to a script she had followed her entire existence. "Your involvement will complicate their assessment." Ethan did not move right away. He just looked at her, really looked this time. Not at the weapon she had been, not at the unknown she represented, but at the person sitting in his kitchen with a plate that had been empty 5 minutes ago and a blanket she had not pushed away, and he shook his head once, small, almost amused. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You are not going anywhere." That stopped her more effectively than any command could have, her gaze snapping back to him, sharp again, but not hostile, more like disbelief layered over something else. "You do not understand the variables," she said, her voice firm. But there was a crack in it now, faint but real. "Their presence will escalate risk. Your survival probability decreases significantly." Ethan pushed himself off the wall and walked past her again, calm, unhurried, as if the numbers she had just given him were just another piece of information to file away, and he reached for a small flashlight from the counter, clicking it on once to check the battery before setting it down. "Maybe," he said, "but you are still bleeding on my floor." The words were simple, almost identical to before, but this time they carried something more, something steady and unmovable, and Lyra stared at him, the logic she had relied on for so long colliding with something she could not calculate, something that did not follow probability or outcome or survival metrics. And for a moment, she did not know what to do with that. The faint vibration in the air grew slightly stronger, still distant, but closer than before, and the night pressed in around the cabin. The broken roof no longer just an inconvenience, but an opening, a line between what was inside and what was coming, and Lyra's hand moved instinctively, not toward a weapon this time, but toward the edge of the blanket, holding it there, as if anchoring herself to something that had not existed in her world until tonight, and Ethan stood there, steady as ever. Like none of this was out of place, like kindness was not a liability, but a decision he had already made and was not about to reconsider. The vibration in the air sharpened, no longer a distant suggestion, but a defined presence pressing closer, like something unseen aligning itself with the exact coordinates of the cabin, and Lyra felt it with absolute clarity now, her training mapping trajectories, timing, probabilities in rapid succession, her mind reconstructing the inevitable sequence of events that would follow. And for the first time since she had arrived, her breathing changed again, not uneven, but deliberate, controlled, as if she were preparing for something she had done countless times before, and yet this time, something was different, something small but undeniable disrupting the pattern. Ethan moved toward the window, not rushing, not reacting with panic, just stepping into position and pulling the curtain aside slightly, enough to glance out into the dark tree line beyond his property, his eyes scanning the quiet landscape that had been unchanged for years until tonight. And he saw nothing at first, just the wind brushing through branches, the faint outline of his old pickup truck sitting where he had left it earlier that evening, everything exactly where it should be, and yet, the air felt heavier, like the space itself was aware of what was coming. "You said they do not allow failure," he said, letting the curtain fall back into place as he turned slightly toward her, his voice steady, almost conversational. "What does that mean for you?" Lyra did not answer immediately, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the cabin, as if she could already see the path closing in around them. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than it had been before, stripped of authority, reduced to something closer to truth. "It means correction," she said. The word lingered in the air, heavy with implication, but she did not elaborate. She did not need to, and Ethan nodded once, not because he understood the full scope of it, but because he understood enough to recognize what kind of people did not leave room for mistakes. The hum from her arm device shifted again, not unstable, not alert, but something in between, as if it too was processing conflicting inputs, and Lyra's hand moved instinctively toward it, fingers hovering just above the surface before stopping, not activating anything, not adjusting, just pausing there as if the next action was no longer automatic. "You should leave," she said again, but this time the words lacked force, lacking that earlier certainty, and Ethan shook his head before she could finish the thought. "No," he replied simply, the word quiet but firm, like a fact he had already accepted. She turned toward him fully now, her eyes locking onto his with a sharpness that had nothing to do with threat and everything to do with disbelief. "You are disregarding optimal outcomes," she said, and there it was again. That language of efficiency, of calculation, but it sounded different now, less like doctrine and more like something she was repeating out of habit. Ethan took a step closer, not invading her space, but closing the distance just enough to be heard without raising his voice. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I just do not leave people when they need help." The words landed harder than anything else he had said, not because they were loud, but because they were simple, and Lyra felt it. That impact, not physical, not measurable, but real, like something shifting deep within a system that had never been designed to change. Outside, a faint light flickered briefly between the trees, so subtle it could have been mistaken for a reflection, but it was not random, it was controlled, precise, and Lyra saw it immediately, her gaze snapping toward the window, her entire body responding in an instant, tension returning. But this time it was different, layered with something else, something she could not isolate. "They are here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and for a moment, everything held still, the cabin, the air, the space between them, suspended in that fragile balance between what had been and what was about to happen. Ethan followed her gaze, his expression unchanged, his posture steady, and instead of stepping back, instead of creating distance, he did the opposite. He reached out, slow and deliberate, and adjusted the edge of the blanket around her shoulders, the gesture small, almost insignificant, and yet it cut through everything else like a line drawn in certainty. Lyra froze, not from fear, not from threat, but from something far more unfamiliar, something that had nothing to do with survival or strategy, and in that moment, with something approaching from the darkness and every calculation telling her to move, to act, to revert, she did not. She stayed exactly where she was, her hand still resting near her arm device, her eyes locked on his, and for the first time in her existence, the choice in front of her was not defined by orders or outcomes, but by something else entirely, something she had no name for. Only the quiet, undeniable awareness that whatever came next, she was not the same as she had been when she fell through his roof. The light beyond the trees did not flicker again. It stabilized, faint but deliberate, like something calibrating its position rather than revealing it. And the air carried that same subtle pressure, no longer just a signal, but a presence that knew exactly where it was going. And Lyra felt it in every layer of her awareness, the timing, the approach vectors, the inevitability tightening around them with quiet precision, and yet she did not move, not in the way she had been trained to, not in the way her instincts demanded, because something else held her there, something as simple as a hand adjusting a blanket, something as impossible as being treated like she was not a threat to be managed but a person to be cared for. Ethan stepped back after that small gesture, giving her space again, his movements unchanged, steady as if the world outside had not just shifted toward them, and he reached for the flashlight, checking it once more before setting it near the door, then glancing up at the broken ceiling with a quiet sigh, like the inconvenience of repairs still mattered even now. "If they are looking for you," he said, his voice low but clear, "then they will come through the easy way first." Lyra turned her head slightly, tracking his meaning, and her gaze moved toward the open ceiling, then toward the door, her mind mapping the structure, the weaknesses, the angles, and for a brief moment, the old patterns surged again, the calculations aligning, the solution forming with perfect clarity, isolate, reposition, remove variables, and yet when her hand shifted, it did not reach for a weapon, it hovered instead, caught between what she had always done and what she was now considering. "They will expect resistance," she said quietly. "That is how I was designed." Ethan gave a small nod, as if that confirmed something rather than complicated it. Then do something else, he replied. The simplicity of it landed harder than it should have, and Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly, not in defiance, but in thought, the idea itself almost foreign, not resisting, not complying, but choosing something entirely outside the framework she had been given. Outside, the faint light shifted position, moving closer now, threading through the trees with careful precision, and the vibration in the air deepened, no longer subtle, no longer distant, and Lyra's arm device responded with a soft tone, a quiet alert that resonated against her skin, and she looked down at it, at the interface she had trusted for every decision, every action, and for the first time, she did not activate it. They will identify me, she said, her voice steady but softer, as if she were stating a fact she had already accepted. And then they will act. Ethan stepped toward the door, his hand resting briefly on the frame as he looked out into the dark, not searching, not scanning like she would, but simply observing, grounded in the space he knew, and he let out a slow breath, the kind that settled everything inside him into place. Then we make sure they do not see what they expect, he said. Lyra watched him, really watched him, the way he stood there without armor, without calculation, without anything that should have made him capable of standing against what was coming, and yet he did, not because he thought he could win, but because he had already decided not to leave, and that decision carried a weight she had never accounted for in any equation. The light outside moved again, closer still, and a faint shadow passed between the trees, smooth, controlled, and Lyra felt the moment closing in, the point where action had always followed without hesitation, and her hand finally moved, but not toward the weapon she carried, not toward the device that would guide her response. Instead it reached down, slowly, deliberately, and set the blade on the table beside the empty plate, the metal surface catching the dim light, silent, still, no longer part of the equation. Ethan did not react to it, did not even look, and that made the moment heavier, more real, because it was not acknowledged as something unusual. It was simply accepted, and Lyra straightened slightly, the blanket still resting across her shoulders, her breathing steady, her gaze shifting from the door to him and back again, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer the voice of a weapon following orders, but something else entirely, something uncertain but chosen. Then I will not be what they expect, she said. The words settled into the cabin, quiet but firm, and outside, whatever was approaching continued forward, unchanged, unaware that the variables inside had already begun to shift beyond its calculations, and inside, for the first time, Lyra was not preparing to execute a directive. She was preparing to decide. The light reached the edge of the clearing and stopped, not abruptly, but with a controlled precision that felt deliberate, like a presence choosing exactly where to be seen and where not to be, and the vibration in the air settled into a steady hum that pressed gently against the cabin walls, not breaking them, not forcing entry, just waiting, as if whatever had arrived did not need to rush, because it already knew the outcome it expected. Ethan stood by the door, one hand resting loosely against the frame, his posture unchanged, grounded, as if this was just another quiet night interrupted by something unusual, and Lyra stood a few feet behind him, the blanket still around her shoulders, the plate empty on the table, the blade resting where she had placed it, untouched, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The night outside held still, the trees barely shifting, the air cold and sharp, and then a faint line of light traced across the ground just beyond the doorway, not blinding, not aggressive, just present, like a boundary being drawn. Lyra felt it immediately, the recognition deep and absolute, the signature of something she had always responded to without hesitation, and her body reacted before her thoughts could catch up, a subtle shift in balance, a readiness that had been conditioned into her from the beginning, and then she stopped, because this time, there was something else, something stronger than the instinct to comply. They are scanning, she said quietly, her voice steady, but no longer aligned with the certainty it once carried. Ethan nodded once, not looking back at her, his eyes still on the faint glow outside. Then let them, he replied. The words were simple, almost dismissive, but they settled into the moment with a weight that changed its direction, and Lyra watched him, really watched him, The way he did not adjust his stance, did not prepare, did not calculate. He simply stood there, present, unguarded in a way that should have been impossible, and for the first time, she understood that this was not ignorance, it was a choice. The light shifted slightly, narrowing, focusing, and for a brief second, it brushed across the threshold of the doorway, touching the edge of the floor, the broken wood, the scattered fragments of what had been a table, and then it paused, as if evaluating, as if something on the other side of that line did not match what it had been programmed to find. Lyra felt the moment stretch, the decision point, the place where she had always acted without question, and her hand moved again, not toward the device, not toward the blade, but toward the edge of the blanket, holding it closer around her shoulders, grounding herself in something that had no place in her previous world. "I am here," she said, not loudly, not as a declaration, but as a statement of fact, and the words carried something new, something that did not belong to orders or directives, but to choice. The light outside did not advance, it did not react in any visible way, it simply remained, steady, observing, and the hum in the air softened slightly, as if recalibrating, as if encountering a variable that did not align with its expectations. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, glancing back at her for just a moment, and there was no fear in his expression, no urgency, just a quiet acknowledgement, like he had been waiting for her to arrive at this point all along. "Good," he said. The single word settled into the space between them, warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, and Lyra felt it, the final shift, not a break, not a loss of what she had been, but an expansion, something added where there had once been nothing. Outside, the light began to withdraw, not retreating, not defeated, but adjusting, pulling back into the trees, the hum fading with it, leaving the night to return to its natural quiet, the wind moving again, the air clearing, and the boundary that had been drawn dissolved without resistance. Inside the cabin, nothing moved for several seconds, the stillness settling into something different now, something no longer tense, but resolved, and Lyra lowered her gaze slightly, her shoulders relaxing fully for the first time since she had fallen through the roof, the weight she had carried shifting into something else, something lighter, though she did not yet understand it. Ethan turned back toward the kitchen, glancing at the broken table, the scattered debris, and then up at the hole in the ceiling with a small sigh. "I am going to need more wood," he muttered, almost to himself, and the normalcy of it landed softly in the space, grounding everything that had just happened into something real. Lyra looked at him, at the man who had chosen to stay, to feed, to offer, without expecting anything in return, and for a moment, she said nothing, because there were no words in her language that fully captured what had changed. She stepped forward slowly, her movement no longer precise in the way it had been, but intentional in a different sense, and she stopped beside him, her gaze following his to the broken ceiling, and for the first time, the future did not appear as a series of calculated outcomes, but as something open, undefined, and quietly possible. The night settled around them, calm, unremarkable, and in that silence, something remained, something that could not be measured or predicted, only understood in the simplest way, that he had not raised his voice, he had not raised a weapon, he had simply made her dinner, and somehow, that had been enough.